We are a people that follow after those things that make for peace, love, and unity. It is our desire that others' feet may walk in the same. We do deny and bear our testimony against all strife and wars and contention.
In this podcast, we will finish reading Chapter 8 of the Eye of Faith, A History of Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative by William P. Tabor, Jr. Chapter 8 is titled Depression, a Second World War and Wider Service, 1930 to 1950s. The final section covers the 1940s.
As the 1930s came to an end, and America was being steadily drawn into preparations for a Second World War, the leadership on the facing benches in every monthly meeting was still in either plain dress or a very simple and inconspicuous form of conventional clothing. In the body of every meeting, however, there were vigorous, conventionally dressed Americans active in many aspects of the non-Quaker world around them. These friends, some of whom had been waiting for their turn since the end of World War I, were now beginning to exert strong and influential leadership within the society. The older style of charismatic and traditional leadership, apparently unable to reproduce itself any longer, was beginning to die out. One by one, the great leaders of the old style were being laid to rest. In 1933, for example, Thomas Crawford of Damascus and Jacob Mall of Coleraine, both beloved elderly ministers, passed away. By 1940, Cyrus and Bertha Cooper would be killed in accidents. Carl Patterson and James Henderson would die in 1942. Even so, either in spite of all these changes and pressures for more change or because of them, Ohio Yearly Meeting was strong and a flourishing body as uncertainties of yet another was gathering. As the meeting for suffering settled into silence the day before the 1939 yearly meeting, Wetherhill Hutton was still there, as he had been nearly 25 years earlier during World War I, though he seemed much older now. And he now sat at the clerk's table to write the solemn minutes in the handwriting of an older man. Before him sat other men, old, but still mentally vigorous, who had shared his labor in 1917 and 1918. James Henderson, the visitor of presidents, Carl Patterson, Cyrus Cooper. Within 4 years, these men would all be gone, leaving an awesome gap in spiritual leadership. A majority of the other members of the meetings for sufferings, including the 10 women, had been there since 1919, although several of them were also quite old, with only one member under 50. Out of the deep spiritual exercise of that meeting came a minute suggesting the faith and courage of old men and old women facing their second and more terrible war. The desire had been expressed that all enmity might be removed from our hearts. There seems little we can do but stand and wait in the peaceful nature of Christ's kingdom, facing as he gives us strength the tasks that are before us. Early in 1940, at least 3 local meetings were holding discussion groups about peace, and a peace conference was held at the boarding school. As peacetime conscription became a certainty, the Meeting for Sufferings held its special June session, which authorized an address to the membership to be printed and also be read in each local meeting. They liberated Ohio Yearly Meeting clerk Charles Moreland to attend an AFSC-sponsored draft conference and liberated James Henderson to call upon the president in Washington, and they sent a message to the president. The world had become more complicated. However, so it was no longer possible for a Quaker prophet from the hills of Ohio to have an audience with the president. James Henderson did, however, succeed in handing the president's secretary a personal letter to the president, as well as a written prayer on behalf of the president, and he soon received a response signed by President Roosevelt himself. The time had now arrived for Ohio Friends officially to recognize at least some groups from other Quaker traditions. At their 1940 yearly meeting, it was evident that many members of the yearly meeting, Albert Lige, Wetherill Hutton, and Charles Moreland among them, had been actively in touch with pacifist leader in the wider Society of Friends, especially the American Friends Service Committee, and with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Although the world was about to endure a war of unprecedented mechanized and methodological brutality, the lessons of World War I and the strong cooperation of Quakers and other pacifist organizations would give the American conscientious objectors a somewhat easier time than they had experienced in 1917 to 1918. In this crisis, the yearly meeting was now quite willing for its members to have a concern, to work with groups like AFSC. Perhaps the first official mention of AFSC was the Meeting for Sufferings authorization, approved later by the yearly meeting, for Charles Moreland to attend AFSC meetings concerning conscription. Charles was also appointed as Ohio Yearly Meetings' first representative to the Friends World Committee for consultation. The yearly meeting was quick to take another new step, appointing a committee of young friends, and they were really young, to work with the Meeting for Suffering on the problem of selective service, soon to confront the young men. The 1940 Only Current gave further evidence of the activities and concerns of the year. The congressional record of 6-18-1940 contained Chesterfield Meeting's 4-paragraph statement on peace. Brian Thomas had worked with during the summer at Quaker Hill, Richmond, Indiana, which was now a refugee hostel, as was Scattergood, which had been reopened for this purpose in 1939. Wilbert and Nina Braxton, who had led an AFSC work camp during the summer, that fall only accepted its first Quaker students, 2 refugees from Holland. In one of Witherall and Ellen Hutton's last communication to their former students and alumni, they seemed to sum up the prevailing mood of the time. Dark as the present hour seems to the eye of faith, sees as above the cloud the shining of the sight of the Sun of Righteousness. Early in 1941, the Joint Committee in the Meeting for Sufferings decided to take the unusual step of raising $1,000 before yearly meeting time, therefore without yearly meeting authorization, to support the new AFSC program for camps for conscientious objectors. As a result of hard work by peace churches and other pacifist organizations, the Selective Service Act had finally provided for the conscientious objector classification to be given by the local draft boards to sincere and religious objectors, thus avoiding the trauma, confusion, and bad example of requiring COs to go to camp with other draftees. When drafted, men with such 4E classifications would go directly to the civilian public service camp administered by one of the peace churches. At the onset, the AFSC agreed to supervise 3/5 of the camps, which were to be located where conscientious objectors could do work of national importance, which in practice turned out to be forestry, park maintenance, and similar physical, outdoor, and remote work. As further test of each man's sincerity, the law at first required for each conscientious objector to pay for his expenses, about $35 a month. In addition to this, there were general administration expenses, and it soon became apparent that most men would need financial help. There would also be many non-Quaker conscientious objectors who had neither financial nor moral support from their non-pacifist churches. Ohio Yearly Meeting, once it was aware of these needs, decided to make its first official contribution to the AFSC through the Meeting for Sufferings. Ohio Yearly Meeting continued to raise money for the AFSC camp program throughout the war. When the books were closed in 1946, Ohio's yearly meeting contribution totaled $23,484. Brian Thomas became the first Ohio Yearly Meeting conscientious objector by speeding his own introduction in the summer of 1941. After a short term at the Quaker Hill Camp, Richmond, he became assistant director at Buck Creek Camp in North Carolina. At its August session in 1941, the Meeting for Sufferings learned that 2 members were now in CPS, that's Civilian Public Service, and that another was in the Cadiz jail for non-registration. After America entered the war in 1941, the number of camps gradually rose. In 1943, 9 members were in CPS camps and 2 were in prison, while about 15 members were in the armed service. By August 1944, Charles Moreland reported to the Meeting for Sufferings that 13 members were in CPS, 8 were in detached service, 2 were in prison, and 1 was paroled to the AFSC offices. He did not list the member who were in military service. In 1944, April only current list of graduates showed that a few more than half of the drafted men, 32 out of 55, were in CPS, detached service, or prison. The list does not specify how many of the men in military service were in non-combatant medical units. Although the hopes for this more civilized program for conscientious objectors had been very great, many of the men found the camps remote from the world's real and desperate needs, and as Brian Thomas and others reported to the Meeting for Sufferings in meeting of 1942, there were many personal and group problems in the camps, so that a few men began to walk out, preferring prison to the frustrations of meaningless work and in the intense problems of group life. Apparently, no Ohio Yearly Meeting members did walk out, although by 1946, at least 4 or 5 had refused to cooperate with the military system, even by registering, and so were sent to prison. As an aroused America mass-produced and mobilized an awesome military machine, as the Japanese Americans were interned, as various kinds of rationing were imposed, as pressures were put on employees and even school children to buy defense bonds and defense stamps, friends in Ohio and elsewhere sought to live out their peaceful convictions. The AFSC developed the Civilian Public Service Fund bonds and peace stamps so that adults and children could choose a peaceful kind of patriotic contribution. A November 1942 only current article by Joe Canby reported that only students were conducting a drive to sell as many peace stamps as possible. One indication that at least some friends were under heavy pressure to buy defense bonds or stamps can be inferred from a letter made available to friends from Harold H. Bedlow, Executive Secretary, Defense Savings Staff for Ohio, and official Treasury Department Savings Staff letter paper, which reads, "Through this letter, we appeal to all Americans to fully respect your position and to recognize such alternative methods of support of your country as you have elected to follow. We feel certain that you will not be unduly or unfairly dealt with by other patriotic Americans who are interpreting their responsibility in terms of selling war savings bonds." Throughout the war, that ends the quote. Throughout the war, some members of the yearly meeting, especially Charles Moreland and Albert Livesey, were quite active. Since he was retired in 1941, it was possible for Charles Moreland to attend several meetings every year of the Civilian Public Service Executive Committee in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or Richmond, Indiana, and he visited several of the CPS camps. He was also visited among the yearly meeting communities, both to report on conditions and to be there as a minister. Albert Livesey, as clerk of the Peace Committee, was equally vigorous as an attender of the pacifist conferences and special meetings like those which eventually created the Friends Committee for National Legislation. He regularly brought the challenging speakers, some of whom were strong pacifist leaders from other groups into the Fellowship of Reconciliation. For the Saturday evening programs of Yearly Meeting Week, he was also instrumental in arranging for at least some of the many pacifist speakers who now stopped at the boarding school or who spoke in one of the communities. Of course, other members of the yearly meeting were also active in many ways, and some were also members of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. In 1944, the Peace Committee under Albert developed a great concern for peace education within the yearly meeting, and in 1945, they sponsored weekend visits by Harold Chance to several of the meeting communities. Many Quaker leaders, like Harold Chance, were concerned that Quakerism was in danger of losing its peace testimony. They pointed out that even conservative Friends, who had the highest percentage of conscientious objectors of all Friends groups, were obviously losing ground in this area. Even when the war was over, the Peace Committee would continue to be active, buying appropriate books for the Olney's Library, providing speakers, and holding an occasional peace conference for the yearly meeting membership. In addition to Charles Moreland's visits to some of the CPS camps, the yearly meeting tried to keep in touch with its young men in other ways. In 1941, the Peace Committee had sent mailings to the 135 members of draft age, and in 1942, the yearly meeting sent a letter to all men in the military service and to the men in CPS. In 1942, letters were sent to men in prison, and in 1943, Charles Palmer, a Philadelphia Friends minister who had often attended Ohio yearly meeting, visited many COs in the federal prison under the auspices of the American Friends Service Committee. In spite of the efforts by some Friends to keep in touch with young men in civilian public service and in military service, some of these young men felt abandoned and forgotten, never being visited or written to by a representative of their own local meeting. When the war was finally over in 1945, the yearly meeting sent a conciliatory letter to its members in the armed forces in the hope that they would feel free to return to their meetings, which would still, of course, maintain the peace testimony. At the same time, the Peace Committee reported setting up a committee to aid returning conscientious objectors in finding jobs, since they might be discriminated against them. A year later, they reported in the yearly meeting minutes, our own members apparently have had no difficulty in securing employment. Perhaps we have not been diligent enough to find such persons outside our own membership, although none of those in the armed forces during World War II or afterward were disowned for that reason. More than one of these men reported having received some very strong letters of disapproval or condemnation from one or two members of the yearly meeting. A final exercise regarding the men who had joined military service came in 1948, when Short Creek Quarterly Meeting requested that the subject be handled with decency, forbearance, and love to each other. And the yearly meeting, while stating that one who violates the rules of our discipline should without partiality be admonished, did charge that all such cases proceed with care and tenderness. The 1948 yearly meeting also issued 30,000 copies of a small leaflet, Statements of Our Position on War and Peace, when a new draft law was enacted. Although this new law completely exempted qualified conscientious objectors from any kind of service, many more young pacifists, including conservative Friends, were choosing the absolutist position of non-registration, which usually resulted in a prison sentence. In 1948, the Olney Current noted that 6 graduates had been sentenced as COs, and in 1949, Omer Morris told the yearly meeting about the 20 Quaker boys imprisoned at Springfield, Missouri. Military conscription, meaning prison or alternative service for most young Ohio Friends, would be a part of American life until the early 1970s. The boarding school did not merely survive the war in the 1940s, it emerged from this period in a much stronger financial condition, with more facilities and an expanding clientele, even while it served as a very important focus and hostel for the stream of Quaker and non-Quaker visitors who passed through it and who enriched the life of once isolated yearly meeting. In those days of frequent trains and buses, Bardesville was a convenient stopover for travelers between other Quaker centers. Charles Moreland's gift of the Plummer Farm was perhaps the most important single addition to the school, but there were many other ways in which the facilities were improved, especially in overall maintenance, which had been slighted during the tight Depression years. When gas rationing ended after the war, the modern tradition of work days really began, and friends began to donate hundreds of hours of labor to the school, doing both very skilled and very general labor. Eager volunteers gently repainted halls and rooms in lighter, less somber colors, and year after year volunteers would undertake to cover one more floor with asphalt tile. The school was also modernized with a walk-in freezer, a walk-in cooler, and a new boys' athletic field. The shortage of young men teachers during the war brought changes to the teaching staff. Fewer and fewer teachers were actually members of Ohio Yearly Meeting. The school began to sponsor occasional trips to conferences or Quaker centers like Philadelphia or Richmond. The yearly meeting time alumni meeting was moved to homecoming weekend at Thanksgiving time, since many more young alumni could attend them. These changes and many others brought great anxiety to a small number of friends, and there were some heated exchanges on the floor of the yearly meeting. As one man mildly describes one such incident at the 1948 yearly meeting. After the boarding school report was read, a solemn warning was sounded regarding the acceptance of teachers and students from societies holding unsound doctrines. Then there were some expression in defense. The small but vocal group who were so troubled about boarding school changes got little comfort from most of the reports about the rest of the world of conservative friends. After some years of working closely with the other Canadian friends, Canadians' conservative friends united with two other groups in 1944, and New England conservative friends merged with four other groups there in 1945. Now there were only 5 conservative yearly meetings left, and 2 of them, Fritchley in England and Western in Indiana, were small and discouraged. One sign of strength was Iowa Friends' decision to reopen Scattergood School in 1944, although this did not reduce some of the contact between the 2 yearly meetings. Ohio Yearly Meeting's distant community in Fairhope, Alabama, felt strong enough to reopen its primary school in 1945. Another sign of the changing times was that it was possible to hold a joint meeting attended by both conservative and Gurneyite friends at Salem in 1947. Other changes in the yearly meeting reflected the gradual opening of doors to other Quakers, to the young people, and to more efficient ways of doing things. The yearly meeting, it will be recalled, had appointed a committee of younger friends to share the meeting for suffering's burden in confronting conscription. There was even one unusually young minister in his 30s, Thomas Cooper, whose earnest and powerful messages began to be heard during the yearly meetings. After a lapse of several years, the young friends began holding conferences again in 1946, this time with the blessing of most of the yearly meeting. Several Ohio Young Friends attended the 1947 National Young Friends Conference at Richmond, Indiana, and were pleased when Ohio Yearly Meeting approved their request to appoint young Elton Hall as a representative to the National Young Friends Organization. The door of the American Friends Service Committee had remained open through the meeting for sufferings, ever since it had been necessary to work with them to support CPS. Albert Livesey had worked with the Friends Committee on National Legislation since its inception during the war, and it was allowed on an official place in the life of the yearly meeting in 1948. when representatives were appointed. Early in the war, Charles Moreland had been appointed to the FWCC by the yearly meeting, but in 1943, it could no longer agree on reappointing anyone. However, most Friends valued these organizations and felt it was only a matter of time before the yearly meeting would appoint official representatives to both the FWCC and the Service Committee. Two important organizational changes came in 1949 at the end of a decade of change. As far back as 1935, Carl Patterson had proposed in the Only Current that there should be one nominating committee for all yearly meeting appointments, but it took nearly 15 years before this radical step would occur. The argument against it was that each appointment should be made from the floor under divine guidance or by a special one-time only nominating committee similarly appointed from the floor. Traditionalists feared that a nominating committee with one member appointed by each local meeting might not operate in the spirit. The old theory was a beautiful one, but as Carl has pointed out, it multiplied nominating committees, often composed of the same overused people, and it was very inefficient. By 1948 and 1949, the leadership of Ohio Yearly Meeting was convinced that the democratic reform of representative nominating committee was necessary, for they felt that most committees nominated from the floor usually favored the conservative point of view, much to the distress and frustration of younger Friends. Just as representatives nominating committee speed up the modernization of Ohio Yearly Meeting after 1949, so another controversial change would similarly affect the future. As far back as 1935, the Men's Yearly Meeting had been plunged into a heavy discussion about the desirability of combining men's and women's business session, but ministers Cyrus Cooper and James Henderson were firmly opposed to it. The issue came up nearly every year after 1942 in both men's and women's meetings, with very strong feelings on both sides. It was clear that a strong majority were in favor of the change by 1943, but the way didn't seem to open. And the Women's Minute hoped that the meeting accepted this Quaker delay with nothing but the feelings of love for each other. In 1949, when Charles Moreland, who had been men's clerk since 1937, was finally allowed to retire, he strongly recommended that the yearly meeting be held in joint session. Finally, during the last session on Wednesday afternoon, the shutters were raised so that the outgoing epistle could be heard by the entire group. Then the quarterly meeting representatives gave the expected report. With one or two exceptions, the representatives felt that the time had come to make such a change. It was a painful and stirring time as speaker after speaker rose to speak, while the sky outside darkened with an ominous, gusting thunderstorm. The men's clerk, Lewis Kirk, who presided over the joint meeting, finally wrote the minute which symbolized the spirit of change in yearly meeting, no longer willing to be held back permanently by a very small group. We have love and respect for those who do not feel to unite with this report, but we believe that perhaps the time has come to take this step. It was truly the end of an era and a fitting preparation for the great challenges that would come in the second half of the 20th century. This concludes the reading of Chapter 8, Depression, a Second World War and Wider Quaker Service, 1930s to 1950, in the Eye of Faith, a History of Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative by William P. Tabor, Jr.
The words from our introduction are from Margaret Fell's letter to the King on persecution. The music was composed and sung by Paulette Meyer. More information on her website, www.paulettemeyer.com.
We are a people that follow after those things that make for peace, love, and unity. It is our desire that others' feet may walk in the same. We do deny and bear our testimony against all strife and wars and contention.